Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Late Late Horror Show. I am Dino, as always, and yes, we are going to do the history of old time radio show. I am going to go through the entire catalog of every show ever made or that we know of. Please give a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already. Give a comment down below. What's your best interpretation of the shadow? Let me know. All that good stuff down below in the description box. So with that said, The Shadow is a crime melodrama. Probably one of the most beloved characters to come out of old time radio, which technically came from a magazine, a paper. So anyways, we will talk about the history of that. Air dates and all that at the beginning. Then we get into actors, descriptions, a lot of information even in the air dates for this one. So even though maybe a little tedious, but if you're here for the history, the air dates will be quite nice to hear. So with that said, let's begin, okay? The Shadow crime melodrama. Broadcast history is July 31st, 1930 through July 23rd, 1931 on CBS for 30 minutes, Thursdays at 9:30. The Detective Story Hour, Street and Smith and its Detective Story magazine. The cast was James LaCurto as the Shadow, a mystery man who served only to narrate an anthology of crime stories. Frank Reddick as the Shadow after LaCurto's departure a few weeks into the run to do a Broadway play. The director was Bill Sweets. Then we get September 6th, 1931 through June 5th, 1932 on CBS. 60 Minutes, Sundays at 5:30. The Blue Coal Radio Review. Blue Coal, sponsor. A variety show highlighted by a half-hour shadow mystery narration. The cast was Frank Reddick as the Shadow. Orchestra, George Earle, said by the trade press to have played the lead briefly in 1932. Anthony Tolan, writing in the Shadow scrapbook, doubts this but allows that he may have filled in for Reddick on occasion. October 1st, 1931 through September 22nd, 1932 on CBS for 30 minutes. Thursdays at 9:30. The Love Story Hour, Street and Smith. The Shadow narrated material from the S&S Love Story magazine. Cast was Frank Reddick as the Shadow, Elsie Hitz and Ned Weaver in an anthology roles. January 5th through February 2nd, 1932 on CBS for 30 minutes. Tuesdays at 10. The first series to use the Shadow as its title. Perfecto Light. Perfecto Light was the sponsor. The cast was Frank Reddick as the Shadow, still a narrator only. Orchestra, Eugene Ormandy. October 5th, 1932 through April 26th, 1933 on NBC. 30 minutes. Wednesdays at 8. Then at 8:30. Also, October 1st, 1934 through March 27th, 1935 on CBS, 30 minutes, Mondays and Wednesdays at 6:30. Both runs sponsored by Blue Coal, a watershed series, the end of the Shadow as narrator and the beginning of the characters' active participation in the stories. Thank goodness. Cast Frank Reddick as the Shadow. James LaCurto in a few 1934 episodes. September 26, 1937 through March 20th, 1938 on the Mutual Network for 30 minutes, Sundays at 5:30. Blue Coal, sponsor. Cast Orson Welles as Lamont Cranston, who in the Orient learned to cloud men's minds so that they could not see him, and is now known as the Shadow. Agnes Moorehead as his friend and companion, the lovely Margot Lane. Ray Collins as Commissioner Weston. Producer Clark Andrews. And directors Martin Gable and Born Ruthroth. 1938 transcribed 30 minutes syndication for B.F. Goodrich, aired in the summer months. Cast also was Orson Welles and Margot Stevenson as Lamont and Margot. September 25th, 1938 through December 26th, 1954 on the Mutual Network for 30 minutes. Sundays with seasons that generally ran from September to April at 5:30 p.m. until 1945, then at 5 p.m. Blue Coal was a sponsor. 1938 through 1949. Grove Laboratories. 1949 through 50, U.S. Air Force, early 1951. Wild Root Cream Oil, 1952 through 1953. Various sponsors, 1953 through 1954. The cast, as Lamont Cranston, the Shadow, Bill Johnstone, until March 21st, 1943. Brett Morrison, 1943 through 1944. John Archer, 1944 through 1945. Steve Kirtley, September through October of 1945. Then again we get Brett Morrison, October 1945 through December 26, 1954. As Margot Lane, Agnes Moorehead, 1938 through 1939. Marjorie Anderson, 1939 through 1944. Judith Allen, opposite John Archer, 1944 through 1945. Laura Mae Carpenter, opposite Steve Kirtley, September through October of 1945. Leslie Woods, 1945 to 1946. Grace Matthews, from 1946 to 1949. Gertrude Warner, from 1949 through 1954. Alan Reed, Keenan Wynn, Everett Sloan, and Mandel Kramer as Shrevey, the talkative cab driver. Dwight Weist, Kenny Delmer, Santos Ortega, Bernard Lenrow, Ted DeCorsia, and Arthur Vinton as Police Commissioner Ralph Weston. Arthur Vinton in other roles requiring clear and resonant voices, Radio Guide 1939 states. Everett Sloan in voices requiring the sound of youth whenever you hear a newsboy or a weak young man who is led astray, said Radio Guide. It was probably Sloan. The creator was Walter B. Gibson. Directors, here we go: Harry Ingram, Dana Noyes, Chick Vincent, Bob Steele, John W. Lovestone, John Cole, Wilson Tuttle, etc. John Barclay, Blue Coal's distinguished heating expert, for the show's most consistent sponsor. And I think Blue Coal has taken on a life of its own also. Just saying. The Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Coal Company, which paid the bills until the coal market collapsed in 1949, was impersonated by Tim Frawley and Paul Huber. The writers: Edith Meiser, script editor; Harry Engman, Charlotte; Edward Hale Bierstadt, Jerry Devine, Sidney Sloan, George Lothar, Peter Barry, Alonzo Dean Cole, Max Ehrlich, Robert Arthur, and David Cogan; Stedman Coles, Frank Kane, Gail Ingram, Jerry McGill, Alfred Bester, Judith, and David Bublik. Announcers: Ken Roberts, 1931 through 1932, and 1935 through 1944. David Ross, 1931 through 1932. Arthur Whiteside, circa 1937 through 38. Don Hancock, from 1944 through 1947. Andre Baruch, 1947 through 1949. Carl Caruso, 1949 through 51. Sandy Becker, 1951 through 1953. Ted Malley, 1953 through 1954. The sound effects, I always say most important: Al April, Barney Beck, Walt Gustafson, Al Schaefer, and Fritz Street. The organists: Elsie Thompson, Rosa Rio, Charles Paul. The theme: Omphale's Spinning Wheel by Saint Sounds playing spookily on the organ. Oh my God, I probably butchered that. If you don't know by now, I have a problem. I'm dyslexic, a little bit of something, so I get words wrong. It's Omphales, Spinning Wheel, by Saint Saens, played spookily on the organ. Now here we go. The story of the Shadow, perhaps radio's most famous fictitious crime fighter, has been thoroughly documented by its creator, Walter B. Gibson, and radio historian Anthony Tolan in The Shadow Scrapbook. It was the epitome of the radio crime drama. Today it remains one of the 3 or 4 shows cited by people as a synonym for old-time radio. The medium is routinely defined as The Shadow, Fimmer McGee, and The Lone Ranger. Sometimes Inner Sanctum or some other famous title is plugged into the mix, but The Shadow is a given. It makes everybody's list. The character combined the strongest elements of rank, melodrama, and delivered them as truth. There may not have been a believable story in the entire 25-year run, but The Shadow thrived, claiming at various times audiences of more than 15 million a week. It opened a new era of pulp magazine superheroes, its print format harkening back to the days of the dime novel. I gotta love that. Its fans would never forget the signatures or the premise, the spooky organ theme, the airy laugh, the electric voice. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows. A Blue Coal commercial was followed by exposition. The Shadow, Lamont Cranston, a man of wealth, a student of science, and a master of other people's minds. devotes his life to righting wrongs, protecting the innocent, and punishing the guilty, using advanced methods that may ultimately become available to all law enforcement agencies. Cranston is known to the underworld as the Shadow. Never seen, only heard, as haunting to superstitious minds as a ghost, as inevitable as a guilty conscience. Cranston had learned the hypnotic power to cloud men's minds so that they cannot see him. He had been taught this by a yogi priest in India, as he explained in one episode. Cranston's friend and companion, the lovely Margot Lane, is the only person who knows to whom the voice of the invisible shadow belongs. Together, Lamont and Margot confronted the maddest assortment of lunatics, sadists, ghosts, and werewolves ever heard on the air. Evil doctors holding lovely ladies for experiments, too terrible to comprehend, were standard fare. In one show, a madman intends to replace the woman's brain with that of a gorilla. In another, an evil genius captures Margot Lane and tries to replace her vocal cords with those of a dog. There were villains who wanted to poison the city's water. There were killers in opera houses and wax museums. The titles gave ample description of content. The Laughing Corpse, Death Rides a Broomstick, and They Kill with a Silver Hatchet are a few. As creator Gibson tells it, the character evolved almost by accident. In 1930, Street and Smith, prolific producers of pulp fiction magazines, decided to try the new medium, radio, in an effort to boost circulation. Once a week, a drama would be adapted from an upcoming issue of Detective Story. Adapter Harry Engman Charlotte added the gimmick of the mysterious host, called him the Shadow, and left the link to the magazine's somewhat tenuous, apparently, wrote Gibson in his Shadow scrapbook. Some listeners didn't get this message clearly, because instead of asking about Detective Story magazine, they wanted the magazine that told about the Shadow. The answer was obvious, a new magazine with the Shadow as its nucleus. Gibson, then a hustling freelancer whose acquaintances included magicians Houdini and Blackstone, was called in to help develop the character and get the new publication off the ground. Readers and listeners were solicited for input. A contest announced in Detective Story and promoted on the air offered $500 cash reward for best descriptions of the elusive host. Slender clues were given on the Detective Story Hour as to his appearance, habits, and tastes. The contest ran through February and March 1931, with judging by pulp writer Edgar Wallace, who went on to be adapted from the creamy horror genre, which led into the giallo horror genre in Italy. New York policeman, a private detective, and others. The winner, John G. Porter, described his shadow as just over 40, tall, and strikingly slender, with slim hands and small, narrow feet, yet possessing a giant's strength, a tattooed cobra on his chest, college graduate, accomplished linguist, in other words, a combination of brains and brawn. Beginning with the first issue of the Shadow magazine, April 1931, Gibson stepped onto a relentless treadmill, writing a full novel for each issue. Working under the pseudonym Maxwell Grant, He became one of the busiest practitioners of the pulp era. By 1932, buoyed by success, the magazine had become bi-monthly, and Gibson was writing a novel every 2 weeks. Ultimately, he would do more than 280 shadow books. Holy Moses! It was Gibson who gave the shadow his everyday name, Lamont Cranston. Nothing was said in those early days about invisibility. Cranston was known as the shadow because of his elusive capabilities, coupled with his habit of stepping out of the shadows to capture a culprit. Also conspicuous by her absence was Margot Lane, strictly a radio creation and still several years away. But even then, the character captured the imagination. On radio, and especially in the pulps, the shadow thrived. That chilling laugh was audio magic. But for the first 5 sporadic seasons, the character remained outside the stories as a narrator of a general crime anthology. As early, kind of like the Crypt Keeper, for crime. As early as 1931, Street and Smith wanted the radio shadow to follow the pulps and take an active role in the plays. The new sponsor, Blue Coal, resisted this. In 1937, the sponsor's representatives agreed to let the shadow become the hero on a trial basis. Margot Lane was created, always scared of change. Margot Lane was created for romantic interest, and most of Cranston's magazine's cohorts fell by the wayside. The regular supporting characters on radio were Shrevey, the talkative cab driver, and Police Commissioner Weston. Shrevey of often spelled Shrevey in print. Listen, am I getting it wrong? I know the shadow, Shrevey. In printed accounts, but Shrevey by Gibson was the standard comic relief, usually to be found on the perimeter of a story, squirting Lamont and Margot to some new adventure at death's doorstep and chattering insanely. Commissioner Weston was, especially in the early years, a vain and bullheaded man who refused to take even the simplest advice, but was quick to accept the glory after the shadow had wrapped up his case for him. Margot was simply Lamont's best friend. Their relationship deepened gradually from Lamont, Margot to darling, though to all appearances they had a thoroughly asexual relationship. Sex was never seen, never heard, as haunting to practical minds as a ghost, as elusive as a guilty conscience. They shared extraordinarily and unchaperoned adventures and somehow managed to escape the wrath of the right-thinking people who had threatened stations, licenses with protests over the harmless Adam and Eve skit on Edgar Bergen's Chase and Sanborn Hour. Orson Welles, Bill Johnstone, and Brett Morrison were the best-known voices of the shadow. Welles was a 22-year-old unknown, a regular toiling in anonymity on the march of time. When he won the role in an audition, his salary, $185 a week, seemed a fortune for a half-hour weekly job that required no rehearsal. His agreement with Blue Coal allowed him to go on without as much as a prior peek at his script. Thus, as he told film director Peter Bogdanovich when he was thrown into a snake pit, he didn't know how he'd get out till the show ended. He was the first shadow to be freed of omniscient narration, and the results were dramatic. A blizzard of fan mail deluged the network, according to Welles' biographer Frank Brady. Shadow fan clubs sprang up around the country, and Orson would occasionally appear at stores and social functions, swathed in black hat, cape, and mask for special promotions. I love it. But his laugh was then considered wrong for the role. And throughout the Wells era, recordings from the earlier Frank Reddick series were used for the signatures. Blue Co. carried the show across 2 decades. A subsequent split sponsorship had Balm Bar carrying the show in the South, Carry Salt in the Midwest, and the United States Air Force in the far West. Through it all, the Shadow remained a cruel and unforgiving dispenser of justice. From the guilty, he obtained confessions using intimidation and torture. Then he crackled that electric laugh as the hapless killer was carted away to the death house. His closing line, like the opener, was memorable. The weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows. It is difficult to overstate the impact that this program had on children of the 1940s. This writer vividly remembers an episode when the Shadow tracked down a murdering scarecrow. When the killer's coat was ripped off, revealing nothing but straw. The implications were so terrifying that the young writer-to-be could not sleep in an unlighted room for weeks. Today, it's the highest of all high camp, scaring neither the aging collector nor its jaded children. So there you go with the Shadow. Listen, one of the greatest characters to come out of old time radio. I think some are starting to pop in the forefront, like Johnny Dollar and others the same, but nothing could ever really beat the Shadow. And with that said, hopefully you enjoyed it. Give it a thumbs up. Please comment below on your thoughts on the Shadow. And until next time, you guys, much love.